to be Australia's greatest ever race caller, Mr. Joe Brown.
Thanks, Greg. It's not often that a real champion emerges in any sport, and when one does, there's a certain charisma attached to that person or animal. Greyhound racing has such a champion at the moment. Striding Ahead is a black bitch by Tivoli Chief out of Lexia, whelped in April 1977, and is owned and trained by Mrs. Pat Huss at Tynong. Striding Ahead has been rewriting the record books at Olympic Park with a total of 25 wins at the track, the last 9 in a row, both records in the city. Said by many to be the fastest beginner ever, Striding Ahead's 29.91 seconds for the 511-metre journey is a record for a bitch at Olympic Park, and next Monday Striding Ahead will be running in race 6, a heat of the Celebrity Stake, formerly the Lord Mayor's Trophy. She'll be trying for her 10th on end and 26th Olympic Park win, so it's your chance to see a champion in action. But at the speed she travels, you won't want to blink too often. And here's a chance for people now outside the greyhound racing industry to get into the ownership business. The Commonwealth Greyhound Association name really isn't Joe, that's just a family nickname given to him as a child. But the family name Brown is as genuine as is the man himself. A month ago, when Joe handed in his resignation, I sat down with him in this very studio and talked to him for an hour or more. The program which follows is an edited version of that chat, put together by our Sports Night producer Bob Wiley and Peter Booth. And we've entitled it Joe Brown Calling.
Down the outside of the field, Golden Black is going with it at the 200-metre mark. It's on the outside, Van der Hum is in front. It's Van der Hum from Golden Black, Reckless and Happy Union. That's the 100 metres left to go. Van der Hum from Golden Black, Reckless and Suleiman coming home well. But Van der Hum, he's walked across the line.
What got you into to race broadcasting?
Well, it's a strange thing, Dick. I always wanted to be a race broadcaster. Many years ago, I'm told, when I was a small boy, that I used to get out in the backyard and get up on the fence and act as an auctioneer and that sort of thing. Anyway, it came to the position where I fancied myself a bit at the game with no experience. So I wrote to the manager of the ABC in Hobart, Mr. Ted McCann, and he gave me an audition, spoke to me and sent me to Elwick, and I called that race. And then I was made assistant broadcaster to George Stannard. And I was with George for about 6 months doing the odd race here and there, and I got impatient, and there was a job advertised, assistant judge to the Hobart Turf Club. I applied for that and got it, and temporarily gave the broadcasting away when I was acting as assistant judge. And then eventually, in 12 months or so, George retired, and I immediately was grabbed by Mr. McCann and took over as the ABC broadcaster in Hobart, and I called 2 Hobart Cups in 1946 when Paramount won it, ridden by Ron Evans, and in 1947 when Wingfire, owned by Dr. Ratton and ridden by Scobie Breesley, won the race.
So, in fact, you came to the ABC position with only 3 years' experience in race broadcasting.
That's right.
You were born in Victoria.
That's right, Dick, yeah.
But you're a Tasmanian at heart.
True enough. You see, I was only 3 when we went to Tasmania, and most Tasmanians believe that I was born in the Apple Isle. Well, it is not so, but I suppose the misconception comes about by the fact that I was reared, educated, and started my working life there. But I was in actual fact born at 49 Hammond Road, Dandenong, on the 19th day of November, I beg your pardon, the 15th day of November, 1919.
And the National Trust is about to declare that a national monument.
It's still there, Dick.
Really?
That old homestead is still there. It's had a bit of a facelift, and I often, when I'm out that way, I'll go down Hammond Road and have a look at it. And the old home is still there. At that time, my father, he was a stoker on the Loongarna, and she was plying between, doing the Bass Strait run between Melbourne and Launceston.
And, but you settled in Bridgewater?
Well, when Grandfather Brown, we went with him to Hobart, he went to Lower Sandy Bay. He took the Riverview Hotel, which is still operative. It's the hotel just down past the West Point Casino. We went there first, and from there, we went to the Derwent Hotel at Bridgewater.
And that was a famous old hotel in which you had some financial interest for quite a while.
I did, finally, after the death of my grandfather and my father, yes.
Now, you came to Melbourne to replace Jack Havey, who had in turn replaced Jim Carroll. And in 1947, you're quoted as saying that Jim Carroll was the greatest race commentator of all time.
Yes, he was my idol at that time. I thought Jim, he was one of the pioneers of the game. You go back to the Bill Priestleys, the Eric Welshes, Fred Tuppers. And in Sydney, of course, Lockie Melville, Cyril Angles and those men, Keith Nowden, Brisbane. But Jim, I always liked Jim's, the method of his calling, his style of calling, and let's remind ourselves of the fact that he was one of the pioneers of the game and one of the men who did revolutionise calling. In those early days of calling, they were lucky to get through a field as quickly as what the present-day commentators do. But Jim Carroll, Eric Welsh and those fellas, they revolutionised the game. And Jim had some wonderful cliches.
And was he a great influence on your style of calling?
He was a good help to me, yes. When I came to Melbourne, Jim would get me and we'd talk about things, and he'd... one of the little things, for instance, he said to me on one occasion, don't worry, Joe, if you get a packed field and you can't see the horse on the outside, keep going back along the inside rail. You'll see all of those.
Good advice.
Yeah, was too.
Now, you mentioned Eric Welsh.
Eric's still going strong. Saw him last Melbourne Cup Day. No, Oaks Day. Bill Collins brought him out and met Eric again.
He was a great caller.
Ah, great caller, Eric, my word. Yeah.
And a very knowledgeable man apart from racing.
Apart from racing, yes, a great knowledge of all sport, eh?
And Fred Tupper?
Yeah, Fred, great caller too with 3AW.
What about the changes in style of race broadcasting since 1947?
Yes, they speeded up a bit, Dick, and they would go through a field much more often than some of the old-timers, but we've got to the stage now where these present-day crop of fellows, they're real professional men, and I can't see how they could improve upon it. I mean, you don't want to go so fast that it becomes inaudible.
Some of the old-timers, like Ken Howard, called 31 Melbourne Cups.
32.
32? Oh, that's right, you called 33. Tom Moon was a racing journalist.
Yes, he was a racing journalist, Tom.
Well, that's an unusual double, to be a journalist and a caller.
Well, Eric Welsh was a racing journalist before he took over with DB. He worked for the Commission, you know, before he went to DB.
And he had some difficulties broadcasting races at times when the race commentators weren't allowed on the course.
Well, the only ones on course were the Commission, Dick, because we were course broadcasters. And Eric and Fred Tupper were outside the course in the Pioneer Hotel at Footscray across the river. It's still there, the little box up through the roof in the old Pioneer Hotel. It's still there where they are. I think Fred Tupper worked from that, and Eric worked from the corner of the William Anglis building, which has since been burnt down and rebuilt.
And how did they get on at Caulfield?
They were on the railway side there, Queen's Avenue, isn't it? They were in a double-storey place there. It's situated round about the 800-metre mark. How they ever picked a winner, I'd never know.
And the Valley?
At the Valley, they were down the school side, down by the school there. And at Mentone, they were across the other side of the track.
Well, just speaking about some of the difficulties under which races are often broadcast, there was a fire in the Flemington Grandstand one day.
Yes, and my great old friend Jack O'Brien, my technician, who Jack put to air 40 Melbourne Cups, you know, 12 with Jim Carroll, 2 with Havey and 26 with me. And Jack always carried a battery box. And he lugged it very heavy too, you know, those old batteries. He lugged it for 20-odd years, to my knowledge, never used it. And the day the hill stand burnt down at Flemington, we got to air. We were on air. The others were off, because the moment the fire brigade got there, they turned all the power on the course off. But we got to air because Jack had carried the battery box. He said, there you are. She came good.
And what sort of a delay was there?
There wasn't a delay, Dick. They ran it. The public weren't interested in the fire. They were interested in the last race, the Welter at Flemington. I opened the door just before they called them in. They were open barriers in those days, and just before the starter called them up, I had a look out, and I said to Jack, I'm ready to leave. I wasn't going to be caught.
It's a long jump over the front.
We got through it, and by the time we came off air, we left the district very smartly, because the flames were going about 20 or 30 feet in the air. But that was a great achievement for Jack O'Brien to carry that battery box as long as he did, and on the one occasion it came in very useful.
Did he leave it in the stand?
I don't know. I think I just took my binoculars. I don't know what else was left.
Race book and everything.
Yes.
The infamous black cloud that came over that Melbourne Cup, won by Vanderham.
Mm-hmm. I'll never forget it, Dick. Johnny Tapp was down from Sydney. John came to me, what do we do? I said to John, I said, now, when they get past the 1,600-metre mark, just stay with the leaders. And I really thought that was it. If I stay with the first 3 or 4, after you call about 24 horses and get back to the lead and you can't distinguish them, it's pretty hard to remember what was there before. So I decided I was going to do this, and I fell for the thimble and the bee. They got around to the 1,600. I went right back through the field. I could feel I was doing it all right, and I grasped them, I had them. Got through to the tail end and back to the lead, and they're right on the point of the turn. And there were 8 horses with all the same colours, all black. So Joseph had to pad, and I was very nervous at the time. And anyway, we picked them up after, I suppose, half a furlong or so. But, it was a disaster, that one.
Is that your worst moment in
yes,
racing?
My worst one, yes. You didn't know what to say, and the nerves take charge of you, sort of thing, and didn't know what to do. And all of a sudden, the colours become visible. We were right.
And you must have had some other bad moments. For instance, the day a scratched horse was actually running.
Oh, yes, Magic Gold. I'll never forget this. The late Jim Ahern was the chairman of stewards. And Jim rang me up. They're just about to go out of the 6 furlong shoot at Caulfield, and he said, "Joe, number so-and-so, Magic Gold is a scratching, taken out by order of the stewards, acting on veterinary advice at such and such a time. Bookmakers notified to line their books. An announcement regarding betting with bookmakers will be made later." Yes, right. I go on course, do that. And away they go. They've gone about, I'd suppose, 75 yards, and I find Magic Gold. So I thought, now this horse is a scratching, I better say nothing about it. Kept it to myself. They get halfway down the railway side at the 600. Magic Gold's running about 6th, so I purposely missed him again. They got to the turn and Magic Gold's running 4th, and I thought, well, now, this horse could possibly win. I've got to do something. So on course, I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether I'm going out of my mind or not, but Magic Gold, the scratching, is running 4th. With that, there was laughter everywhere, of course. They'd gone past the post. Magic Gold didn't run a place. Jim Ahern got on the phone immediately to me. He said, "Joe, would you repeat that Magic Gold was a scratching?" So I go on course again and repeat that Magic Gold was a scratching, and everybody's laughed again. They've seen it run, they've seen its colours. But of course what we didn't know was the fact that the phone between the chief stipe and the barrier had broken down, and the trainer had weighed out Magic Gold light without the lead bag. He couldn't get phone, so Jim Ahern, quick thinking, I give him full marks for it. He saved the public their money because they didn't do their brass on Magic Gold. They got their money refunded because he was a scratching officially. But he did run in the race, there's no doubt about that, and made me look a bit of a fool. But that was the reason for it, because the phone had broken down and Jim couldn't get in touch with the starter to tell him to take it out.
Now, some of the horses, some of the great horses, and in, 34 years you must have seen really the cream of Australia's thoroughbreds.
Yes, Talek's the best horse I've ever seen, Dick. He was a great racehorse by Corazan from Florida, bred in New Zealand. Sway-backed horse, no oil painting, but my word, he could gallop. And Tommy Smith bought him, was one of a draft of about 14 when he was in New Zealand, and he eventually sold him to Mr. E.A. Haley. And he won just about everything that was there to win. And in his heyday as a 3-year-old, he had won the Canterbury Guineas, I think it was in Sydney, then he won the AJC Derby, came back to a mile, won the Caulfield Guineas, went up to a 1.5 miles, won the Caulfield Cup, and that Caulfield Cup that he won was run in 2:26.9, which at that time was the second fastest 1.5 miles ever run in history. He went on and won the Victoria Derby, and then Mr. Haley had the idea that he wouldn't run a 3-year-old in the Melbourne Cup with a big weight, and he had to take the penalty for winning the Caulfield Cup and carry at least weight for age, being a Derby winner. And he didn't start him in that Melbourne Cup, which straight draw won, which he most assuredly would have won, because in the Derby, Talek beat Prince Darius by 8 lengths, and in the Melbourne Cup, Prince Darius came out and he ran straight draw to half a head. But Talek was a great horse, and it was just a shame that he had that illness and was off the scene for the best part of 12 months, because he'd have won any amount of money and all the big races about the place. But he came back after that illness and proved himself, and one of my most disappointing cups, of course, was 1960, the Centenary Melbourne Cup, when it was an all-New Zealand result of High Jinks, Howsey, Alunk. And there was the great Talek with 10 stone to floundering and trying to get at them. He finished about 7th, I think, in that race, the only time in his career that he was unplaced in a race.
Rising Fast.
Second best horse I've seen, Dick, a great stayer, Rising Fast. He won the Caulfield Melbourne Cup double. When Ivan Tucker brought him over, he's owned by Lester Spring. At home, I've got the life story, Racing with Rising Fast, the first copy presented to me by the owner and author, Lester Spring, one of my prized possessions. And Rising Fast was a great horse. After he'd won the double here, he was left with Fred Hoisted at Mentone. Then he came out the next spring and he won the Caulfield Cup again. And he ran second, beaten by the very light-weighted Toparau, ridden by Neville Selwood. Rising Fast that year was ridden by Bill Williamson. He was beaten narrowly, there was no protest, and of course Toparau won the race, but Neville Selwood afterwards was given 2 months for interference by the stipendiary steward, Mr. Alan Bell. And I think Bert Wolfe, Cardigan of the Herald, wrote the story many years later on the retirement of Mr. Bell. Had Williamson protested, his question was, would he have got the race? He said, most assuredly. So he's a very unlucky horse not to go into the record book as the only horse ever to win the Caulfield Melbourne Cup double in successive years.
Comic Court.
Great horse too, Dick. As a 3-year-old, he won the Victoria Derby, failed in the Melbourne Cup. And that was the year Alistair started favourite, and no, it wasn't. He won the Derby as a 3-year-old, naturally enough, failed in the Melbourne Cup that year. He came out as a 4-year-old, he won all the weight for age races, failed again in the Melbourne Cup as a stayer, but as a 5-year-old, he got stamina with age. And I can remember Mick Alessio. Comic Court was trained by Jim Cummings, and his strapper was Bart Cummings, his son. And I remember Mick saying to old Jim at Flemington one morning, he said, Jim, he said, this horse has found stamina. And lo and behold, Alistair had won the Derby for Bill Ballock, ridden by Jack Purtell. And Jack stayed with the 3-year-old, despite the fact that they hadn't won a Melbourne Cup since Skipton, a 3-year-old. And Jack stayed with Alistair. Pat Glennon got the lucky ride on Comic Court, took him to the front, 6 from home, and that was it. Good night, Twilight, catch me if you can. And when he was let down, shows you what a great horse Comic Court was. His first up run after that was in the 6 furlongs, less 20 yards, William Reid Stakes at Moonee Valley, and he drew 1. And it was always thought of that 1 was no good at the 6 less 20 shoot. They said go, and that's the last they've seen of Comic Court. He won the William Reid first up after the Melbourne Cup.
Came back from the Melbourne Cup to
won the William Reid
sprint.
Stakes, 6 less 20.
Incredible.
He was a great horse.
Of the 33 Melbourne Cups you've called, which gave you the most pleasure?
The first one, Dick. The first one, Rimfire, because I was only a young man, and naturally enough I was very nervous about the whole business, and it was the first time that the camera, the photo finish camera, had been used for a Melbourne Cup. And Rimfire, ridden by Ray Neville, defeated Dark Man, ridden by Jack Thompson by about a half head. They used the photo, and my position then in the broadcast box was about 75 yards prior to the post, favouring the outside runner, which I think helped me because it was Rimfire. But they settled down to a ding-dong struggle in the straight. Neck and neck they went to the post, and I was fortunate enough to say I think Rimfire might have just beaten Dark Man. And then, of course, my ego blew up to high heaven. But Ray Neville, he was only a young fellow at the time. Ray was had his 16th birthday the following week, and he was apprenticed to the great old trainer Lou Robertson and Mr. H.G. Raymond owned Rimfire. And he only had about 6'7", you see, had a problem to get him a jockey. So he got in touch with Mr. Robertson and said, could he have young Neville to ride? He said, yes, but we won't tell him till the morning of the race. So the lad wasn't told until about 45 minutes before the race that he had the mount on Rimfire, but he duly won it. And I was talking to Ray's wife, incidentally, on the phone only a couple of months ago. In his scrapbook, Ray has got all the details of his winning the Melbourne Cup, but he didn't have a recording, so I sent him a cassette of Rimfire's Melbourne Cup.
And talking about horses leads us, of course, to the men who ride them, the jockeys.
Yes, well, I've seen a lot of great jockeys, Dick. When I came in 47, our leading jockeys were Harold Badger, Scobie Breasley, Bill Williamson, Ron Hutchinson. Oh, they were great riders. And then, of course, in Sydney we had Billy Cook, Morris McCartan, Ted Bartle, Darby Munro. And,
George Moore.
Oh, George, they're fantastic riders. And I give the vote to Darby.
Why?
Well, I've seen Darby win on an inferior horse. Darby had everything, a complete horseman, beautiful hands, great balance, great judge of pace, and the quickest thinker I've ever seen in my life. Could make a split-second decision and it'd be the right one.
But he's been painted down the years as a bit of a villain.
I remember Darby in an interview once. I don't know who it was interviewed him. It was either Lockie Melville or Jeff Marnie, I'm not sure now. And they said, you've had a few nicknames, Darby. He said, yes, I know what they call me over the fence. He said, the Demon, the Coon. He said, they've called me everything. But the Demon, great rider, Darby, D.H. Munro.
What makes the Melbourne Cup the great race it is?
I think, Dick, it's all this pomp and pageantry and the lead-up, apart from the fact that nominations close in June and weights are issued months before. But on the day of the race, you know, the Governor-General in his open carriage escorted down the straight by the mounted troopers on their white chargers, and then before the race, the massed Highland bands, they have a go. And they're very good, those Highlanders, when they're 1,000 strong. They're trying to concentrate just before they go to the barrier. And one day they'd performed and walking down past the judge's box, and a fella out the front of my box started to clap. I said, "Don't clap, old chap, for heaven's sake." He said, "Why?" I said, "They might come back again." But I think it is the pomp and pageantry and the lead up to a Melbourne Cup, and everybody gets up on the toe, and I was able, only with years of experience and with age, able to counter that, so much so that last year I went into that race knowing in my own heart that it was going to be my last Melbourne Cup, and I was flat on the ground and quite okay about it all.
But for 32 years it did get
yes,
the adrenaline pumping.
Oh, for sure, yes. You get on the toe. There's no way known. If you weren't a little bit toey about the whole thing, you wouldn't be doing your best, I don't think.
Has the Caulfield Cup got the same charisma about it?
Not exactly, Dick, but no, you do get toey before a race like that, yes. It's the first leg of the double, a big race, and always the top quality horses. Yes, it's got something about it too.
Do you get frightened of making a mistake?
Oh, yes, yes. Dead scared of it. You don't want to. I know to err is to be human, and we all make mistakes. I've made them, and the man that hasn't made them hasn't been born yet. But I feel that I am there to do a job for my listening audience, and I want it to be right.
That's always been your guideline?
Yes, I know a lot of people strive for perfection. That's an impossibility in my game. But I always try to do my very best, and, you know, if you can keep it, say, 95%, you're right.
What do you try and convey to the listener?
Well, it's a mental picture, Dick. You see, a race broadcaster is a little bit different to an actor. Now, an actor has a script. He learns his lines. He knows what's going to happen. And he delivers his speech. The race broadcaster, he's got no script. He doesn't know what's going to happen. And he's got to tell a story as it unfolds in front of him in split seconds. And it's a pretty difficult job, but that's what we endeavour to do, to take that picture as I see the race run, to bring that to my audience through my eyes.
So really, being a race commentator is not a glamorous occupation, not the glamour occupation that people think it is.
That's quite true. You're quite right there. It's not the glamorous one. I did it principally because I wanted to do it. I had a love to do it. And when I was doing it, I enjoyed it. It wasn't a hardship. And when you enjoy doing what you're doing and it's your mode of income, it's quite nice, quite a decent occupation. But there's not a lot of that glamour that people seem to think it's got.
Earlier, Jay, you mentioned amongst the great administrators of racing, Sir Chester Manifold.
Yeah.
What influence did he have on Victorian racing?
Well, he was chairman of the Victoria Racing Club and a great administrator, raced horses himself, knew what it was all about, and he was instrumental. He went over to New Zealand and saw the way the off-course tote operated there, and he came back, and TAB was his baby. He was a great administrator, a great chairman.
And some others, L.V. Lachelle?
Yes, Snow was secretary, a very fine administrator, along with W.S. Cox. And Cox family, of course, famous. His son now, Murray, secretary of the VRC.
The Cox family was always previously tied up with Minnie Valley.
That's right. It goes right back to the A.V. Hiskins days when he was secretary of the club, and W.S.'s grandfather before him. And the Cox family have been in the racing game all their lives.
A.V. Cuny?
A.V. Cuny, yes, he was secretary of the... He'd just finished as secretary of the VRC when I joined in 47, but he was still there in an advisory capacity to Mr. K.A. Morrison, Mr. Keith Morrison. And Mr. A.V. Cuny was a very great administrator. I think at that stage, Dick, that the Victoria Racing Club had only had about 3 or 4 secretaries since they first started. What, Henry Byron Moore? No. R.C. Baggett, Henry Byron Moore and A.V. Cuny, up to 1947, from 1860.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Harry Way?
Yes, Harry was accountant to the VATC before he became secretary of the VATC, and has a race named after him now, of course.
You were some sort of a sportsman yourself before you became a race commentator. You, in fact, played league football in Tasmania.
I thought this had come.
You didn't expect that I wouldn't have done something, would you?
I wasn't any great shakes at it, Dick, but I did play league football for Newtown in the TFL, and I was a half-forward flanker, you know, Starvation Gully. I wasn't very big, as you could see. I played at about 10'10". Used to get on the outskirts of the pack. Wasn't
a receiver?
Not renowned for boring in, yes, out in the open.
And apart from that, you played tennis and cricket?
Yes, played country week cricket. It's the best I could do. Tennis, I was just a reasonable C grader.
But you were some sort of a professional foot runner?
Well, I could get along a little bit. I enjoyed it immensely. I ran professional because I couldn't afford to run amateur. And I won a few races. I won a quarter at Newtown. I won the gift at Ellendale, Oaklands. And my best run, I ran about 1.5 yards outside even time. I think the clock credited me by running second in the gift at Sheffield on the northwest coast of Tassie. But they were great carnivals along the coast in those days. Always had the big names in the bike riding game come over. Dean Toseland, Bill Moritz, the Guyot brothers, and the Rowleys, all those fellows. It was great carnivals.
And then came the war.
Yes, Dick, I had a stint in the 2nd 40th Division Infantry, but I was medicaled out. I developed a cold abscess on the bone when I was 16, this was, operated on. I came out of hospital the night Marabou won the Melbourne Cup. I vividly remember that, written by Keith Foyder. But when I marched a long way, I couldn't take the route marches, and the Army medicaled me out. And Ted Collis, the late Ted Collis, who was manager of the Hawthorn Club, he had a stint in the Army too, and we used to always boast about our deeds, and I used to boast about the fact that I'd won the Tamer Star, the only man in the 2nd 40th ever to win it. And he said, "What for?" I said, "I kept the Japanese out of Launceston."
And you've had an affinity with the Hawthorn Football Club for years?
Yes, been one of my great loves. It goes back a long way. I was, first of all, a supporter of Essendon in 1947. Simply because Jack O'Brien, my technician, was a former Essendon player and became chairman of the Essendon Seconds. And Jack used to take me out to the functions there of a Saturday night. As a matter of fact, I was at the grand final dinner when they tied with Melbourne. And I was there that night when Dick Reynolds had to keep them well and truly on the ground and not too much champagne flowing, because that front Melbourne the following week, and of course they were beaten. I think that was when Jack Mueller came out the next week for Melbourne, didn't he? He kicked about 6.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in April of this year, in 1981, you were made a life member of the Hawthorn Football Club Social Club.
Yes, I was very proud of the fact, Dick. It was the first time I got my life membership with Alan Martello, and it's the first time a floor member has been appointed a life member. The others have either been ex-presidents, committeemen or footballers. So I've broken the ice at Hawthorn, being the first floor member to be appointed a life member.
Well, you've spent enough time in the club to be almost a shareholder.
I hope I'll spend a lot more there too, Dick.
How would you describe your career?
Oh dear, how would I describe my career? I've been doing something for 35 years that I've loved doing. I've enjoyed every minute of it. If I had my time over again, I'd do exactly the same things again. And what's more, they've paid me for it.
Joe's final race call tomorrow will be of the 3rd event from Moonee Valley, the Moonee Valley Hurdle at 1:35. And as Greg mentioned earlier, as a mark of respect to a great commentator, both Melbourne commercial stations which broadcast the races, 3UZ and 3DB, will be taking Joe's description of the event and relaying it all around Australia. It's the now traditional farewell to a long-time race broadcaster, and I want to thank Bob Cornish and Nancy Helmore of 3UZ and Ian McGregor of 3DB for making the broadcast possible. And from the ABC's point of view, I want to say what a pleasure it's been to work with Joe all these years. He's earned the respect and admiration of millions of racegoers and punters and people interested in horse racing, not only in Victoria, but in all states of Australia.
And Don Ruin on the inside, rather quickly with Orange Touch and Northern